The words procurement integrity will spark different thoughts and therefore different definitions depending on the professional background of the person you're talking to. For example, as a retired government inspector general, the first thing that comes to my mind would be a fair, honest, transparent, legal contracting process, free from fraud or any improper influence. Yet you talk to an investigator and they may have a narrower definition that really looks at a process of procurement as free from fraud. And yet you talk to auditors and they're immediately going to look at effective internal controls throughout the procurement process. You talk to a procurement official and they may hear procurement integrity as a means to meeting compliance requirements set by the government. And anyone else, you may interpret that definition differently. They may interpret it as a set of rules surrounding their conduct and what they can and cannot do. So as you can see, depending on the professional background of the person you're speaking to, can influence how they define procurement integrity. Some of the critical elements for the success of an automated solution to identify procurement fraud are as follows. First, the degree of access to the data in the management system. This ranges from who controls the data all the way to who wants the data. It is important to recognize that there are many systems that do not talk to one another. Plus, the data is owned by separate parts of the organization. The degree of access to these systems will determine its effectiveness in mitigating fraud. Secondly, for an automated procurement solution to be successful, the system typically requires the data from the organization's financial part, their vendor, their human relations or human resources department, and most importantly, when you're talking procurement, the contract management unit. The ability to formulate an automated comparison structure of that data will allow for identification of potential indicators of fraud, such as false claims, phantom vendors, bid rotation, and collusion, to just name a few. Thirdly, confidence in the integrity of that data is critical. Your data is as good as it is entered and validated. Is there a quality check being done to ensure the data is accurate? Who's held accountable for that data if it is not timely entered, or it's incorrectly entered, or not even entered at all? Without good data, any software solution will have its limitations. And lastly, and most important, not only to the acceptance of the technology by who would use it, but leadership's willingness to mitigate financial and reputational damage by setting the tone and culture of a commitment to procurement integrity.
Procurement integrity is an acquisition process that's open, free, transparent, and has been effectively utilized to get fair and cost-reasonable products and goods and services. Well, when you start talking about trying to do data analytics for the purpose of identifying procurement fraud, you first have to step back and think, what are the data sets that I'm going to need? Are they accessible? Are they searchable? And most important, that will identify sufficient indications of fraud without giving me a high level of false readings. Why this becomes important is when you start talking about trying to take data analytics into procurement fraud, so much of the data that's critical to searches is unstructured data. And what I mean by that is this isn't in simple data sets. But the real challenge and most hurdles that companies have to face is they do what they call pay and chase. What I mean by that is they actually have already lost the money to the fraudster. And the key is now we're going to try and find it. The real mystery is how to identify anomalies, false indicators that basically is before the award. How do I identify when potentially the right risk exists that I have a higher probability of somebody actually committing fraud? Now you're talking about the pre-award phase. Now you're talking about the solicitation phase. Now you're talking about the whole world before the actual awarding of the contract. So what's the challenge? The challenge is taking those critical documents that are not in the traditional data sets and extracting from them the right types of information to allow us to identify indicators of potentially fraudulent schemes occurring in the earliest stages. Procurement integrity is a fundamental objective of everybody. There's a difference between a procurement in government and it comes to corporations. Now, for example, a corporation, when they make a purchase or procurement, what drives a lot of that is the best value for the dollar. Well, governments don't always make that decision because sometimes the government has to do purchases in a fashion which Advantage is a smaller minority group, or is a hurricane or disaster. They can't really sit there and say, well, we're going too fast and let's go ahead and not do it because we can't sure we're going to get the best dollar. Sometimes governments have to say, let's weigh the risk of fraud, abuse, waste for the good of the need. Companies really don't have to do that. They basically can take their time and say, listen, let's get the best dollar. Then when you step out into the international community, then you start saying it's a developed country and undeveloped country, and then they also have challenges. So it's never really an easy solution to say, are they all the same? Because they all have different challenges. But I got to tell you, there are similarities. What are your risks? Have you identified your risk? Do you have a demonstrated commitment to procurement integrity? Do you have internal controls in place to protect against your specific unique risks? When you approach fighting corruption and procurement fraud from that perspective, and you start out saying, what's my threat, what's my vulnerability, what's my risk? Can I automate indicators through data analytics, from predictive modeling, from imagery software? Can I do all that consistent with what my risks are and develop solutions to mitigate those risks? That's when you start seeing the similarities.